All right, welcome everyone. So we're going to get into one of the major causes of World War II now, the idea of appeasement. So again, if you're following along in all my lectures, we're doing this whole series of why World War II happened and of course the events during the war. And so what is appeasement and how is this a major cause of World War II? So I'm going to give you a lot of examples. This video might be a little bit longer, but there's a lot of important information here. And so appeasement itself is a pretty understandable term, right? When you let somebody have something so they stop making a fuss, right? I've always used this example to make it super clear for folks. If you have a child, and I have a toddler as I'm recording this, and, they're 4 or 5 years old, whatever it is, and you're walking down an aisle at a supermarket or at a store or wherever it is, and they see something they want, and they say, I want this chocolate or food or whatever, and you say, no, you've had enough sweets. What do? They throw a tantrum and they start screaming and yelling, and the parent is embarrassed, so they say, I want my kid to stop crying, so I give in to them. I give them what they want. Well, what did that child just learn? The child just learned if you scream and yell and throw a tantrum, they get what they want. And, that's appeasement. And what we're going to see primarily between about 1932 and 1939 are several examples of appeasement that helped lead to World War II. Now, I always make this clear before we go into all the examples. The opposite of appeasement is not war, right? It doesn't mean, there's only two options. Either let Hitler do absolutely whatever he wants or lets everybody jump into a war the next day. So there are degrees of what you could do to deal with somebody like Hitler, but I will say this, the longer people waited, your options to deal with him get narrower and narrower to the point where, you really, the only option at the end, of course, was to fight a full-out world war to stop this unbelievable, horrific event that was starting to develop across Europe, what, of course, Hitler was doing along with Mussolini's support and, of course, what's happening in the Pacific. So what are some examples of appeasement? And obviously for all my students, as you're talking about learning the cause of World War II, which one of these examples do I want you to know? Well, all of them. And to be clear, I'm not even giving you every single example. This is just because, again, we're just in a survey course here. I'm just giving you some of the more significant ones I want you to know. So, I use these years primarily between 1932 and 1939 because these are the years that we see, of course, Hitler starting to rise into power. Officially, he comes into power in 1933. And as he comes into power, what is the reaction of countries in Europe? And frankly, the countries in Europe don't think, oh man, this is this horrible evil monster. We need to, do everything we can to get him out of power. You don't sense much of that. And you go, well, why should they? Well, remember, by then he had already written Mein Kampf. And when I discussed this in one of my previous lectures, I talk about, the significance of Mein Kampf, this book that Hitler wrote, is that in this book, you could tell his thinking. No one can claim they didn't know. No one can claim ignorance. No one can say, oh, we didn't know what Hitler was going to do. Not just in Mein Kampf, but so many of the other speeches and writings that he had, he clearly demonstrated his animosity against the Jewish people, his desire for conquest. None of these things should have been a big surprise. So that's already happening, and there isn't much of a reaction. In 1934, nearby Germany, of course, you have Austria. So here we have Germany that we'll see, and we'll talk about what these colors all represent as we move further. Here you see Austria, just south of Germany. Remember, Hitler was born in Austria. And so in 1934, there was, from the direction of Hitler, an attempted coup in Austria to get rid of the power in Austria, the legitimate government in Austria, to put basically a Nazi regime in there. The coup did not succeed in the sense that the regime itself, the Nazi regime didn't take over in 1934. But it's, again, what is the reaction of Europe after doing this? So it's more keeping in mind that this coup happened, and then what happens next as we move into 1935, 1936, based on the fact that this attempted coup took place, should have made people think, uh-oh, we got a problem with this guy. But as you're going to see in 1935, 1936, it was almost as like, coup, what coup? Who cares, right? And that's going to be the unfortunate reaction that we're going to see moving forward. So what's going to happen as we move into 1935, 1936? And again, just so you're clear on this map of what's going on here, the purple, of course, is Germany. These dashed areas there that you see over here that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, that's the Rhineland. We'll definitely talk about that, and I'll explain these other spots as well as we go further. All right, so let's move on. So in 1935, this is kind of the rearmament year, where Germany is going to start rebuilding its military. And, they publicly announced they're going to build an air force. And you go, what's the big deal? Well, those of you who studied things like the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I, one of the key points in that treaty was that Germany was not allowed to build a military air force, but they did. They weren't allowed to have a standing military force of over 100,000 men. And what happened in 1935? They do, 500,000 men. And it's going to, of course, get bigger. And also in 1935, they agreed with England to what is called the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. And this, of course, is going to help Germany build their navy. And what we see in 1935 is therefore a building up of their infantry force, their air force, their naval forces. And again, you go, okay, what's the big deal? Well, again, this is after Mein Kampf. This is after an attempted coup in Austria. This is probably not the person you would want to say, hey, it's okay, go ahead, build your air force. Hey, it's okay, go ahead, build up your ground forces. But again, many countries in Europe just kind of shrugged to this, and they said, well, what are we going to do about it? Now, again, does this mean in 1935 you launch a full-out invasion into Germany? No, but you can do sanctions. You can, do a number of things to kind of put economic pressures, whatever it is, to keep them from building up a bigger military. So then we move on. What happens next? Still in 1935, this is something that really should have made a lot of people panic. And these are what were called the Nuremberg Laws. If you're not familiar with the Nuremberg Laws, one of my other little short lectures I do is about a Holocaust survivor who lived in Germany. And you can find it on my channel as well if you want. And it talks about, I talk about her experience and her testimonials and what it was like, hearing about these Nuremberg laws for the first time. And what these laws were basically laws inside of Germany that restricted the rights of Jewish people. And it forbade, quote, the Jews to marry, quote, citizens of German blood. And the idea behind this was to take away rights of Jewish people inside of Germany. Jews cannot be citizens in Germany. So if you were a Jewish person, you'd lived in Germany for generations, it doesn't matter, you're no longer a German citizen. Germans lost the right to hold, Jewish people lost right to hold, to vote, to hold public offices, just to give you an idea of what these Nuremberg laws were about. So, try to imagine living in a Western civilization country today, just, United States of America, and let's say somebody of, pick whatever group, and they've been, living in the United States for generations, legally living in the United States, never broken any laws, never done anything wrong. And simply because of their race or ethnicity told you are no longer an American citizen, right? You're just no longer allowed to vote. That should worry some folks, right? And this is exactly what was happening in Germany in 1935. And again, very little was done towards Hitler when he was doing these things and implementing these laws. And this is the thing, we talk about later on the gas chambers and the Holocaust and all of that horrible things that we'll get to later. It didn't start by gas chambers opening up one day. There was a buildup of these kind of regulations and rules that eventually, of course, led to one of the most, if not the most horrific event in human history. So that was 1935, again, the lack of reaction to the Nuremberg Laws. 1936. 1936 is a pretty pivotal year. In 1936, a couple things are going to happen. One thing that's going to happen is Hitler is going to move forces into the Rhineland. So this is the same map we had shown before. And in this map, the Rhineland is right here. It's that area that's kind of purple and white. Now, that area is part of Germany, but again, according to the Treaty of Versailles, that area was supposed to be demilitarized. Now, Who should really worry about this? And the obvious answer is France, and Belgium as well and other countries, but especially France, because this is not the first time France and Germany have been at each other's throats. This is a long-term history of conflict between them. And if Hitler is moving forces into the Rhineland, if you're France, you're going to be a little bit worried. And it's very interesting, what happens. He moves into the Rhineland. Obviously, there's some mumbling and grumbling and all that, but nothing really happens. Nobody puts any pressure on Hitler. And a few years back, as I'm always reading and doing more research and trying to find more information, I came across this quote by Hitler. And he said this after the fact, but this is such a powerful telling moment. And this is what Hitler said about his move into the Rhineland. He said, "The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking in my life. If the French had marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw." And so what that is saying is that he even knew, Hitler himself knew, that if they actually stood up to him in 1936, guys, World War II may never have happened. If 1936 the French said, no, you cannot take over the Rhineland, in that point, Hitler was still not strong enough to fight them off. But because they let him do this, it emboldened Hitler. It gave him more power to do even more. Would there have been conflict in 1936? Yes. But would entire World War II break out, like I talked about, with 50 million plus deaths? Probably not. And so this moment, I think, where he moves into the Rhineland and no one reacts is pretty important. Now, one point that comes up very often is people say, well, this is hindsight's 2020, right? It's easy for us today to look back and go, boy, this was really a mistake. Why didn't they see this coming? But I will say this, if you want to research this in more detail and spend more time on this, you can find plenty of examples, and I'll give you a couple of examples here in a moment, actually, of people in the 1930s who said, hey, this is bad, we shouldn't follow this appeasement policy. The problem is they were not the ones in charge, and they were not the decision makers. The other thing, of course, in 1936, you get this alliance between Hitler and Mussolini, what is called the Rome-Berlin Axis agreement, and this is, of course, very significant because when you ally Germany and Italy together, from a geographical standpoint, you're splitting Europe in half. And so this is important for strategic reasons as the war is going to eventually begin. And again, very little reaction as a result of any of this. So again, appeasing these actions of Hitler and now Mussolini as well. 1936, not only was there nothing done, in 1936 there were Olympic Games held. And where were these Olympic Games? Folks, they were in Germany, in Berlin. And, this is an example of what I mean. There were people at the time who recognized what was going on. And I give this example of a couple names, individuals, Milton Green, Norman Cainers, not household names. I don't expect anybody to know them. But their story is interesting because these were Americans who were Jewish athletes. And they looked at the situation in 1936 and said, we're not going. We're going to boycott the Games. But did nations boycott the Olympic Games? Of course not. Nations went. And, at the very least, you would think after Mein Kampf, after Nuremberg Laws, after, the attempted coup in Austria that he encouraged, after all these, at the very least, you would say we're not going to honor him with the Olympic Games. But again, they did. So I think, to me, this is another really good example of appeasement. They didn't even have the courage to say, no, we're not going to the Olympic Games. At least nations didn't. So I think that's pretty a good, important example. We finally move into 1938. And in 1938, things start to get really bad, right? He annexes Austria. So now Austria does become part of Greater Germany in 1938. And again, countries like France and England and, of course, the United States are just not doing anything about this. Then in 1938, you get one of the most classic examples of appeasement. A lot of these other things I've been talking about, a lot of people aren't as familiar about or don't even, always consider it appeasement, so to speak. But by 1938, everything is just so objectively become absurd that, in terms of what Hitler's doing. And the most classic example of that is the story of the Sudetenland. So what is the Sudetenland? Well, it's the sliver of land that you could see here, right over here on this map, between Germany and Czechoslovakia. It's part of Czechoslovakia. And Hitler moves into the Sudetenland. Now, when he moves into the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia is not happy about this. Look, when he moved into Austria, there were people in Austria who fully wanted Hitler there. You know, that's just the sad reality. People, and there are, of course, people who didn't want him there as well, right, to be clear. But with Czechoslovakia, it's like, we don't want this guy here. What is he doing here? Go away. And the people in Czechoslovakia were really upset. And so there was a lot of mumbling and grumbling. And, you know, people in France, people in England were telling Hitler, you can't do this. And what does Hitler do in 1938? He says, okay, let's not, you know, get everybody crazy about this. Let's have a talk about it. So in 1938, after he moves into the Sudetenland, there's a very famous, or I should say infamous, conference now in history called the Munich Conference. What is the Munich Conference? Well, the Munich Conference in September of 1938 is when Hitler called the leaders of Europe together. And there was one in particular I want to mention, a man named Neville Chamberlain. I'll show you a picture of him here in a second. Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of England. And in 1938, Hitler and Chamberlain, along with other individuals, of course, are meeting in Munich. And basically what Hitler says is, hey guys, just let me keep the Sudetenland. I promise, I won't take over any more land. My people just need a little bit of elbow room. I'll be good. And Neville Chamberlain is sitting there listening to this, and brilliant Neville Chamberlain is saying to himself, you know what, Hitler, okay, I want all this in writing. And you know, Hitler says, sure, I'll put this in writing for you. So then Chamberlain is like all proud of himself, you know, he got Hitler to put on this document that he promised he won't take over any more land. Now, of course, if you're Czechoslovakia, you've just been thrown under the bus. But regardless, this is the bigger thing. Let's go to our next slide. Here is Chamberlain, and he, of course, is known as the Great Appeaser because this is one of the more famous photos in history. Because what happens is Chamberlain gets Hitler to sign this paper. You can see it holding up here. And Chamberlain leaves the Munich conference, gets on a plane, lands out of the plane, gets out, takes out this piece of paper with Hitler's signature on it, gives this speech. And in this speech, he tells the world, I have achieved peace for our time. Well, of course, Neville Chamberlain has gone down as one of the biggest fools in history. That he actually believed that Hitler was going to be good. And, you know, I saw a movie recently, and it was it's called, I think, Munich, Edge of War, on the edge of war, and it tried to spin it a little bit. Oh, no, Neville Chamberlain was just trying to buy time for the British to build up, and I'm sorry, I don't buy that. You know, this was just an act by Chamberlain to try to, again, appease Hitler. It's going to be a disaster because, of course, shortly after Hitler, you know, does this agreement, he's going to violate this Munich conference. He's going to take over more land. And so there was no, you know, ramification, I should say ramification, there was no clear good reason for Chamberlain to do this. He just simply did not want to deal with things. And again, all this did is give Hitler more time to become more aggressive. And, you know, again, this is the whole hindsight idea. Look at this cartoon that I want to show you here. And on this little political cartoon, it's kind of, you know, giving examples of all the things Hitler is doing as the years are going by. And so it says here, spineless leaders of democracy over here, you can see here, and Hitler's walking over each one of them. And, you know, on the first one, it says here, the rearmament, and then Rhineland fortification, then Danzig, that's an area as the war begins. He's going to, you know, just as the war's starting, he's going to conquer, then question mark, exclamation point. And eventually it says boss of the universe. In other words, you know, Hitler's going to, what's he going to do next? He's going to take over everything. And so there were political cartoonists, there were other political leaders who just weren't in office who said this was a disaster when Hitler agreed to the Munich Conference, and when Chamberlain agreed to things in the Munich Conference. So there were again people at the time. It's not simply hindsight's 2020 that people realized, hey, this was a mistake. So what are the lessons? Well, one last thing, and then we'll get into the lessons of appeasement. So, of course, people sign this agreement, and Chamberlain agrees to the Munich Conference, and then, of course, shortly after that, 1939, Hitler is going to sign the Non-Aggression Pact with Stalin. So this is something a little bit different, but I do want you to know about. In August of 1939, this was a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany. And what this was all about, of course, is Hitler and Stalin agreed not to fight each other. Now, that's actually a pretty pivotal moment in the story of how World War II begins. And the reason that's important, the Non-Aggression Pact, this is kind of just an aside from appeasement. I just want all my students to know about this, is by signing this Non-Aggression Pact, Hitler knows that when his next step is to invade Poland, he doesn't have to worry about Stalin coming after him because, of course, the Soviets are going to want parts of Poland as well. So they make this agreement. We'll just divide Poland up. And what this means is Hitler will not have to fight a two-front war. For those of you who watched my lectures on World War I, remember this was one of the pivotal things that hurt Germany during World War I is they had to fight a two-front war. And so by Hitler and Stalin doing this non-aggression pact, it allows Hitler to invade all his forces into certain areas of Europe that we're going to talk about in our next lectures. And he doesn't have to worry about a force from the Soviet Union until Hitler decides on his own time that he'll be ready to do that. Because, of course, those of you who know the whole story, eventually he's going to fight a war with the Soviet Union as well. This is all going to be part of World War II, which we're going to explain. So then in September of 1939, Hitler's going to invade Poland. He violates all these Munich Conference agreements, and then not a surprise to many. And it was only after he invaded Poland in 1939 that the war is going to begin. And countries say no, 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 and World War II begins. But by then, Hitler had such a firm grip. Austria, Czechoslovakia, he's going to move into Poland pretty quickly. He's got an ally with Italy that it's going to create, of course, a bloody nightmare to free Europe. And, Hitler's got so much momentum, as we're going to see when the war starts, that the sides fighting Hitler are not going to have a very good time of it in the beginning of the war. So these are the lessons, right? Again, the opposite of appeasement is not war, but there are times in history where it's, objectively obvious you have to stand up to certain individuals in history. And, there are moments throughout time where you could see this, as I'm recording these lectures, you see things unfolding in Russia and Ukraine and so forth. There are, of course, other nations in the world that, are aggressive, and, what do you do about that? And it's not always easy, right? I don't want to say it's always a clear-cut, easy, hey, let's go do this. Fighting war is horrible. But sometimes if you don't fight a war, a small war, you end up with a greater war. World War I, I think it's very fair to say people jumped into a war for no reason way too soon. The irony, of course, is for World War II, they probably should have acted sooner, and they didn't, and things got worse. And so, yes, hindsight's 2020, but I think the lesson of appeasement is sometimes it's pretty obvious. And, I think World War II is the classic example of that. So definitely you want to know all those examples of appeasement. They're very important. You need to know that. So this is kind of the longer of my World War II series lectures, but I wanted to kind of put this all together in one lecture for you. And then we'll start getting into the war itself, the battles themselves, in our subsequent lectures. So I hope all that's clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.